Right, so you know how this works now. We don't go in for big intros and big people up too much. We let them explain who they are themselves. So this is Shona Murray from the mainstream media. Shona, tell us about your career trajectory. How did you get into journalism?
I studied journalism, first of all, in Ballyfermot. And I was always interested in foreign affairs, so then I did a master's in international politics and then a master's in international law.
Right.
But in between that, I was always travelling mainly to the Palestinian territories, and where I found the conflict there and the political situation there just incredibly fascinating, and I've just become quite addicted to it actually. I've been there maybe 15, 20 times, been covering the war in Gaza there, the occupation of the West Bank, parts of Israel, and it resonates really quite a lot with Irish people too. So it's one of those stories that as a foreign affairs correspondent you can actually write about in Ireland. Irish people are interested in, and your editors will sanction it because they know that readers and listeners are really interested in that. Anyway, and then I worked mainly in news talk during that period. And then I moved to the Irish Independent and the Sunday Independent, where I'm special correspondent. So you couldn't get more mainstream.
Buddha was blessed with a gift of God, and it's a gift I have that keeps me from these cutthroats.
Was your interest in Palestine and things like that before journalism?
Yeah, well,
and did you travel there before you were a journalist?
No, I never travelled there before as a journalist, but I was always interested in it. My parents are not uber political, but they would talk about politics a lot, and one of those subjects was the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And then just, watching BBC Channel 4 all my life as a kid, was just fascinated by it. So it was something that I knew about slightly in the back of my mind. And again, we in our state, our politicians have always been quite interested in it. So even I remember going back to watching TV as a kid, and you'd see, Yasser Arafat on RT News quite a bit, more so than you see any other world leader.
Yeah.
And our, Minister of Foreign, I think people like Brian Cowan as Foreign Affairs Minister, people like that used to go there. There was a lot of visits. Michael D. Higgins, the current president, he used to visit there a lot. So it was one of those conversations that was always on the background, so I had a bit of tacit information on it. And then I actually did one of my dissertations was on the military necessity of the West Bank wall. So I became academically interested in it as well as politically and journalistically, and so.
Yeah, so the format of this is non-adversarial, so I'm not going to grill you too much on the necessity of the West Bank wall. No, actually, because it kind of skirted over a little bit how you ended up in journalism, because I know I went to Ballyfermot for a year as well, and the career trajectory for me wasn't then catapulted into journalism. I kind of got into journalism by accident. I wrote the novel, and then there was a mural up in Stony Bar just up the road, and I had that phrase known to Gardaí, and then someone asked me to write an article about it, and that's how I kind of accidentally fell into it.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are trying to break into it and can't. So how did you go from studying, what was it, media in Ballyfermot?
Yeah, studied journalism, and then so I started working, I suppose, voluntarily in local radio stations.
Right.
And Olivia was one.
I know that radio. Yeah.
And then work experience in news talk, and a couple of the Irish Times.
So you just applied for work experience?
Yeah, I knew a few people who worked there, and
Right.
I wasn't doing work experience. I was actually working as a broadcast assistant, which was a non-paid role. So I would go in, and I started working at the Foreign Affairs show at the time, which doesn't exist anymore. And so it was actually a role that I was there every week. So I worked there for a couple of years before I started getting researcher shifts, and so it kind of evolved into that way. It wasn't like a 2-week thing. And then I did work experience in, I guess, the Irish Times, the Indo. So all of those things, you gather some experience, and I guess you decide if it's for you, and the industry decides if you're for it. Because you're come under a lot of pressure, even though you're only sort of a junior. You just see the cut and thrust of it, and whether or not that excites you, and you're going to want to be passionate enough to engage in it. Some people just say, well, this is definitely not for me. For me, the exact opposite happened. I was completely committed.
And so what was the story with you did a master's in international law. So were you thinking of going down that route? Were you thinking of getting into a kind of diplomacy career, or intelligence agencies, or?
Well, I wouldn't say diplomacy, but actually it really helps me as a reporter working in foreign affairs. I studied Islamic law, I studied international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions. So when you're working in a war zone, and people are talking about something being a war crime, you actually learning international law, you can decipher what's actually a war crime and what's legal under the Geneva Convention, because we know collateral damage is something that's illegal, and when an army is taking a decision to strike on and has an objective, they have to take into account that civilians will be killed, and often, you know, it is legal to kill maybe 20, 15 civilians depending on the necessity of that strike. Because let's say if you had a weapons factory with the capability of killing thousands of people or a couple of hundred people, and there's intelligence to say that whatever the enemy is going to strike at some point using it, well, you know, your objective is to prevent that. And sometimes, you know, in the interim, civilians die, and that's collateral damage.
You use the passive there, die, rather than
are killed.
Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean to. I'm not. You can use semantics as well. I think it's horrific too. But it's a theatre of war, and that is horrifying.
Yeah.
But the point is that as a reporter, you can have a conversation about proportionality and whether something could actually be described as a war crime or not. And so that's why I actually studied international law, was to enhance my reporting career. But that doesn't mean down the line that I wouldn't necessarily like to take a further interest in it from an academic perspective.
It kind of brings me to another question I was going to ask later, but I'll jump in with it now. So there's a lot of, one of the things that I've been guilty of in my accidental journalistic career is hyperbole. And there's a lot of hyperbole now in the outrage factory and stuff like this. So I think you were kind of making the distinction there between legal definitions and stuff like this. But some people get outraged, you know, I could feel myself bristling a little bit at the kind of academicisation of
war.
Yeah. But so do you find, like, one of the reasons that I don't want to be fucking involved in journalism anymore is because of the pay versus the amount of shit you get. Now everybody, when they read an article, if they engage with it positively or negatively, they contact you. You know, they contact you on Twitter or whatever. Yeah. So you know, journalistic pay I think has gone down, but the fucking,
it's definitely stagnant anyway.
Yeah. Like you're getting shit for days after writing an article, whereas before it was
but I mean,
you'd have to go and write a letter, put it in an envelope, and pay 32 pence to post it to you.
And they still do that as well. But how sensitive are you though when you know that the person's response to an article you've written is you know, deeply without fact or basis? To me it's quite risible anyway. You know that some people would accuse you of being some sort of a spy.
Shill.
Well, shit, right? That's
shill, I said.
Oh, shill, that's it. Yeah, accuse you of all sorts. Well, being shit, being a bad writer, being a lackey for I don't know, a media mogul, being a lackey for an intelligence agency, for a particular party or none.
Yeah.
You know, and then you're like, are you for fucking real? I didn't become a journalist to be someone's lackey. And I remember this happened quite a bit during the Gaza war in 2014, and I have this amazing app on my phone that's brilliantly accurate, and it shows you how many rockets, it's an Israeli app, but it shows you the number of rockets that leave Gaza into Israeli territory, and within seconds of the rockets leaving Gaza, it pinpoints where they are. Now this is, again, it just helps accuracy. And I remember there was a breaking of a truce, and Hamas had sent some rockets over. And I just tweeted, 13 rockets since the truce ending at 8 a.m, which was just a statement of fact.
Yeah.
And then I had this abuse from people calling me, an IDF spokesperson. And I was like, hold on a minute. And these are from Irish far left. And I'm like, I am sitting.
I'm
sorry, but it was, right?
Sure,
I don't care.
Okay, go on.
Anyway, because they're the ones who tend to support Palestine. And by the way, I support Palestine too. But I remember thinking, God, it's 8 o'clock in the morning in Ireland or whatever, or 10 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and you're in bed, in your own little house, looking at Twitter. I'm actually the one here, in a war zone, with a flak jacket and a helmet, for the past 2.5 weeks, just informing you of a statement of fact, and yet then you think you've got a moral high ground to abuse me and accuse me of being a member of the Israeli Defence Forces. And I just find that hilarious. So I wouldn't take any offence to that. And similarly, when you criticise Brexit, for example, which is, and it is a terrible domestic policy. But to criticise parts of it, to criticise people's writing about it, when you're reporting something that's a statement of fact, and people argue when they just completely misunderstand the reality of the situation, I find that hilarious too. Engage when you've got something constructive to say, and then it's a proper engagement.
Yeah. At this point, I'm going to have to shout out to Eddie Dempsey and the York Fall Society who want a full hard Brexit now. Lexit. But
Your exit, no?
look, we're going to avoid the geopolitics.
Okay.
We're going to end up killing each other. And
which is why you have me on though, isn't it?
no, it's supposed to be a conversation, not a fucking slaughterfest.
To be honest with you, I'm also trying to trigger you a little
I
bit.
know that. I can see. I can tell. We'll move swiftly on, but it's relevant. So one of the things I've noticed as well, very sincerely about being around media circles a little bit and being behind the scenes is it's not as homogenous as people make out. It's not as uniformly one political view or whatever. So we just had someone putting that bike behind the bar there. It's not as uniformly one political view, left or right, as people think. There is editorial policy, and the people that end up tend to be from a certain background in that profession. But I think it's kind of self-sabotage on the left sometimes. It's particularly with RTE, for example, to think that there is uniformity. I mean, people in there are arguing all the time, and I think it would alienate journalists, this kind of to constantly claim bias in situations when sometimes there isn't. Like RTE put out some brilliant documentaries, for example. The traveller documentary John Connors did with Kim Bartley, is one that springs to mind.
Health investigations and other things that are challenging.
Really exposed, some of the things. Now there are serious issues. Like for example, with the water charges reporting. Now the Iona Institute were rolled out for balance every time a repeal person was on, and Irish Water are speaking without a Right to Water spokesperson, and Right to Water have been proven to be more accurate on the figures and stuff like this. Also, there's issues with the crime journalism that we're going to touch on later on. For people that would be, my audience is going to be more left than right, I fucking hope. So
the far left and the far right, I've got lots.
No, listen, come here, stop. I know you're just trying to provoke me now at this stage. So so do you think that tendency of people to claim bias so strongly could alienate journalists and turn them against a constituency?
Yeah, there's two things, right? One thing that you did say is right in relation to their criticism, which is the homogeneous nature of journalists, and I think that journalists will admit that.
Yeah.
And it's because, unfortunately, getting into journalism is a very expensive thing to do, because you have to, like I said earlier, first thing I did was have to volunteer and then work for free, and then you have to try and chase a few stories and work as a freelance without any security. So then you're living with your parents essentially, and it's very difficult for everyone to do that, particularly if you want to work in Dublin and the rent is so expensive. And that's a global thing anyway. That's not just a problem with Ireland, but Ireland's specifically bad because our rent is so expensive and the cost of living has gone up so much. So what you have is then you have fewer people from working class areas working in journalism, and not because it's not actually based on their slant. The problem is you don't have people on the ground actually with full knowledge about what goes on in working class areas. And I know that sounds like them and us, and that's not what it's supposed to sound. And actually I remember Jon Snow on Channel 4 News that made this really important point, and he was obviously distraught after what happened with Grenfell Tower. And he said, this is a problem of journalists. We should have known about these, because Grenfell residents had complained before about the structure and that they felt endangered. But none of this stuff was reported because the access, the people in Grenfell Tower were far removed from, let's say, mainstream journalists. And that's a very difficult thing. And so, I think it's also a social conditioning thing. We tend to be used to middle class people telling us, middle class white men telling us initially, the news. Now that's evolving and it's becoming more gender balanced, but it isn't there yet. But certainly what's outside of that is, how do you balance, by the way, for a class either, or I hate that word class, but how do you balance and say, well, we have to have a person from a particular socioeconomic background? You can't really do that, because I suppose it's a form of discrimination, positive discrimination. Are we ready for that? But anyway, the point is right. Homogeneous journalists or the industry being homogenous doesn't make for balanced reporting. That is true.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail precisely on the head there. I was talking to an Irish Times journalist, and she was saying to me that they had kids in on transition year for work experience, and they were all from Clongowes, Blackrock College, all of these private schools, and they had nobody in from the skills in working class areas and stuff like that. And that kind of homogeneity is very dangerous in perspective. It's the same thing with the political class, I suppose, of only certain types of people are being represented, but it's less conspiratorial than people think as well. And as well as that, the writing. So yeah, this kind of leads on to the next question. I suppose people think that control is exerted top down, and you can't say this and you can't say that. That happens sometimes, but it's more to do with demographics, probably, of journalism. That it's slanted a certain way. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's probably true. It's the stories that you come up with. Let's say if you had somebody from, let's say, the Grenfell Tower, or parts of Ireland, Moyross, or wherever. If you had a journalist from there working in a national paper, they would have really great access to what's happening in those estates, because you'd have trusted sources. I mean, locals who would trust them to tell them maybe and honestly what's going on. They'd have the actual truth about maybe the gangs, whether things are changing, evolving for the better or evolving for the worse, or things that happen in the middle of the night, if neighbours are being harassed. Those sort of stories will evolve, and people will actually know the reality of what happens in those estates. Instead, we look at it from a them and us, or outside looking in perspective, and the stories then don't materialise. And so then we would have a greater across the spectrum of the demographics in Ireland. We'd have a greater idea as to what happened, and more people would be represented in the media. And so that's why those stories aren't being told in some ways. I mean, you have journalists on the ground doing their best. We all do. But it's just a natural sort of progression that you just don't know people as well in those areas, and therefore it may not be as easy to get them to trust you. And then the stories then tend to evolve because people have told somebody in a pub on a Friday or Thursday night, or they live in the estate and they know that what's been happening consistently. They know the truth. So that's why it's a difficult thing, and it would be so much better for everyone if it was much more balanced.
Absolutely, and I think we're 60 years behind the times here. So Mark Coughlin is an acquaintance of both of ours, or a friend of mine anyway. I don't know if he's a friend of yours. We kill each other as well online about similar geopolitical questions. But he was the first kind of Dublin accent person that I saw speaking seriously in the media. So you had Joe Duffy and Dustin the Turkey. I think Roddy Doyle might have said that, or maybe it was me, I can't remember. But BBC instituted consciously a policy of having regional dialects, working class dialects, 60 years ago. They got rid of that RP, and now we have a message from our sponsors, this kind of weird accent. As a conscious policy decision, whereas we still have in Montrose accent that people are putting on, and I'm speaking as a linguist.
That's a style thing as well, though, and they're entitled to have that too. It's the pronunciation of certain words so that it's consistent. And you do hear certain other accents besides Joe Duffy that tend to be a little more working class, and also the regional correspondence in Longford.
I would say it's inconsistent. So one of the things they do is, if you listen to their vowel sounds, it's one of the reasons that's easy to tell when someone's putting on an accent is because they can't remember to keep the vowel sounds the same across different words. So they will, the typical one you hear on RT News is mortgage. This weird W insertion in mortgage and things like this, and then they'll say another word that has a similar phonology, and they won't make that noise. So
it's also not rolling off the tongue properly.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not their accent basically, and there isn't any reason for it other than social anxiety and things like this.
Well, I guess also it's a style thing, but I agree with you as well, because some of it just doesn't sound right. Like when they say sexual, it doesn't sound right. And they say issue instead of issue. I always say issue, but again, you feel like the broadcasters are pausing for a moment before they say the word because they have to think about it.
What about Taoiseach? They say Taoiseach with a you hear it a lot on RTE. Yeah. It reminds me of that. Did you ever hear about this is a regression, but the Tony Cascarino, I think it was, and Phil Babb in Italian 90, and Charlie High came in and was shaking everyone's hand, and Cascarino went to Phil Babb, who's that geezer? And he goes, that's the tea shop. And he goes, he owns a tea shop? What? Anyway, moving swiftly on.
That's by the way, I've heard that in Sky News and the BBC. The tea shake. And I'm like, sorry, hold on, how are you a broadcaster with a national unit like Sky or BBC and you've never heard the word Taoiseach before? And that's really bad. I mean, I've seen that twice over the last while, actually several times, because this whole Brexit issue means that Ireland is much more at the fore of the discussion in the UK. And the number of people who can't say the word Taoiseach at this stage. It should be, if you're a journalist in the UK, it should be a term that rolls off your tongue.
Absolutely. And you know, they'll use Prime Minister a lot. I suppose this might be a good juncture to bring up the royal sycophancy that goes on. So I remember, I think one of the worst examples I've ever seen was when the Queen was over and she mouthed a few words in very bad Irish. You know, the pronunciation wasn't on point, that's for fucking sure. And Mary McAleese just mouthed wow, like this. And I'm like, what?
No, I disagree with you wholeheartedly. Actually, that was an incredibly important meeting. It was the first time they had to say, like, there is royal sycophancy, for sure. And I find the Meghan, the visit of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry the other week, I just couldn't get over how people were just swooning in their direction and so overly eager. Now, of course, no harm in engaging in whatever way you want. Like, I wouldn't criticise anyone. We all have our quirks or our guilty pleasures, right?
Yeah.
But I just found it quite sycophantic. Yes, so do I, right? And but no, the Queen's visit is no, you're wrong there, because I'm sorry. We'd come to a point, it was 2011, I'm pretty sure, and I remember, because I actually happened to be in the Middle East when it happened, and I remember watching all of even the Israeli TV and BBC, etc., because it was an important moment. And you see, people, you can't undermine how important these things are, like in terms of transitional justice and the whole transitional justice process. Like they come in stages, and we weren't saying, oh, thank you for visiting us. We were saying, thank you for acknowledging, and the words that she said were really poignant as well. Like, she said, things that shouldn't have happened or should.
She never apologised.
It's not about an apology. There's much more moves. There's just what she did was acknowledge that the British government had done an awful lot wrong, and her visit there, I think, was really a tidal wave in terms of moving our relations much closer together and forgiving the past. And I know hardened Sinn Féin voters who were brought to tears for that. And actually, these things are part of the reparations and the whole process. And I thought that her visit was actually spot on. And I think what annoys me about Brexit is that all that good work is being reversed now, because we see the British really using re-emerging with these old tropes about Ireland and paddies, and Brits belaying to us about our own economy and our own country, and that's offensive to me. But the Queen's visit, I don't think it was actually overstated for its importance.
Right, I'm going to ban the B word from now on because I'm getting triggered here. I'm like a snowflake.
Okay.
But the other thing is, I suppose, like, I was looking at the Meghan Markle thing. Like I said, I just find the whole thing objectionable and just disgusting. I was thinking about when they blocked off. I was out for a drive when the Queen was over, and I came back. I was over in my ma's, was driving back, and a guard stopped me. You can't go down there. And I was going to my gaff, and I said, well, when can I? And he goes, I don't know. And I just had to sit there, and I was thinking about my nanny, for example, who had, was a real matriarch and ran the household on a shoestring and looked after us all, and never had parades or shit like this. And those people were born into this position. People talked about Meghan Markle modernising the royalty, and I think we invented a machine for modernising the royalty in the 1700s. It was called the guillotine. That'd be my position on royalty.
Who's we? We the revolutionaries?
We, yeah, we the people.
Okay, hold on a minute. Disgusting is just the wrong use of the word there, and of course your grandmother.
You don't mince your words. I said I'd go easy on you. You need to go easy on me.
Of course, your grandmother should be celebrated for what she did. Your grandmother, your great grandmother, and similarly my mother, great grandmother. But it's a very separate issue. When you
hereditary.
When you invite a head of state over to a country, there is security apparatus that need to kick in, because there obviously would be a target. And so that just makes sense, and they have their own standards of security that they require. And just because you're inconvenienced, that is not a reason for those visits not to happen. My only issue is that and it's not even a major issue, I just was a bit surprised at how people were falling all over themselves, because the two people in question are not that interesting. But to be outraged about Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, but then what would happen if Putin came over, or Erdogan or someone like that? Then be outraged because those people are human rights abusers, and then be outraged at sycophancy over them.
Well,
don't be outraged.
The Queen is the head of the British Armed Forces, you know what I mean? So, and as well as that, hereditary monarchy to me is, itself a human rights abuse.
Yeah, probably in that, if you want to go back in history. But right now, any of those decisions are made by politicians.
Yeah, we're not supposed to be arguing here, and
Sorry.
we're just
Okay.
we're
You
getting
keep triggering me, so.
I know. I knew this was going to happen. Okay, listen, I want to make it more about journalistic procedures and things like this. So I think what a lot of people don't know, and even was surprising for me, was the process of how something goes from an event in the real world, real people interacting, in a specific place at a specific time, into a story in print or on the screen or whatever. So how does that happen? What is the process of transmission from event to story?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're covering as well. Like for me, like one of the things that I love the most about being a journalist is talking to people, literally just being on the ground, and it mainly tends to be in foreign areas for foreign conflicts, and so sometimes you can be covering a war or a conflict, and the people who make it to the top line of your story are the people who have just lost their family in an airstrike, or have just escaped the Islamic State, or barrel bombing in Aleppo, and they're in a refugee camp, or they've just emerged from the front line. And their story is all invariably so compelling that they are more important than the peace process element, or the talks between the two armies that trying to build a truce. And so to me, that is what I search for. Yeah. And if you're talking, and particularly when it comes to broadcast, because they're often the stories that they tell the story themselves. Those words are much more important. And when I was building, let's say, a report for radio, we'd always use the first clip, which was invariably the person telling the story about how an airstrike had killed their 2 kids, or they just narrowly escaped, or and people would just want to listen to the rest of it. And then after that, you can tell the story about where you are from a political perspective.
So you've kind of brought me back to when you were talking about the rockets into Israel and things like this. So there is always an element of choice, even with facts in what you present. So I would say there's an element of volition in that. But I want to talk specifically as well about the process. So one of the things that I've found incredibly difficult to navigate in my accidental former career as a journalist, because I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not doing it anymore. Fuck that shit. It was the worst addiction I ever had in my life, and I've had a few. Is the relationship with editors and things like this. So it's not just a case of you pick these stories and it goes forward.
Oh, no.
It's
there's a negotiation.
So let's talk specifically about print first, for example, because I think it's different in the different media.
Yeah.
So you've had that. You interview a few people, or you talk to sources who you mightn't be able to cite, or things like this. And how does that then go? So do you write up the article? Do you present your notes? Do you pitch the article?
Yeah, I mean, it depends, I suppose, on what's happening, what's relevant, what we need. I mean, if you're talking about, I'm going to have to say Brexit, but not, let's say, from an opinionated perspective, but mainly because I cover it the most. But if you're talking about, let's say, a decision made by the British government on, let's say, last Friday, white paper, then the most important thing people are asking is, will this be accepted by Brussels? Is this the starting point of a realistic agreement? And so the first thing I'm going to do is get on to sources in Brussels and Ireland and ask the questions as to whether or not this is workable or will actually be rejected straight away. So that's the first thing, and that's what you need. That's what people want to know, because that's who the UK is answerable to. And often you can't cite those sources, because if they were to come out and say it publicly what they actually mean, then from a political perspective it would just be so destructive. And then it's difficult not being able to cite those sources, but as a journalist, and this is the difference between the mainstream media and also other media outlets, you have much stronger responsibility to make sure these things are right. And I know that the sources I have are at the most senior level, and people have to trust you. And when you're working on a beat, they tend to have more trust in you anyway. And that's how you get sources in the end. And so the editor has to make a decision and
so
say,
what's the editor presented with? Is it presented with a version of the story, a draft?
Basically, Brussels sources say Theresa May's offering is likely to be rejected, or otherwise. And then also, let's say you get a leak from somebody, a source, and you physically have to have that maybe document in front of you, or be shown it to be able to prove and say that this is what it is in black and white. And again, it could be from sources, but if you could tell people that you've seen it yourself, then there's a lot more trust added to it. So then there's obviously just reportage when you're at an event or covering something similar, and then you're hearing, that you have to navigate what's the most important part of what you've just heard. And maybe you're wrong, maybe you picked it up wrong, or maybe what you think is most important, the editor doesn't think that, and the editor might come back to you and say, well, actually, I think what he said is more important. And I'm like, no, but I think what she said has more relevance or more impact. And invariably, it's the editor that's actually going to decide. But of course, you'll have an argument, a discussion, or there may be some pushback, and maybe there's an agreement. Then we'll keep them both high up on the page.
So I found though that editors will just change things without my knowledge or consent or anything. One of the ones that happened to me for a company you worked for as well before was they inserted the phrase "begs the question," which is a notoriously bad phrase to use because the general understanding of it is a misunderstanding. So even if you use it, it was used incorrectly in this instance, which it usually is. It's a phrase from formal logic, so it has a very, very specific and restrained meaning. And it made me look a bit like a dickhead. I felt. Now nobody else fucking noticed it.
Yeah.
But I was very angry.
That's the thing that does actually annoy you. Because you work hard.
So did I not give you before they publish them, after they've edited something, they don't give it back to you? See, this is bollocks. I can't cope with that.
I mean, it depends on the type of thing you're writing as well. If it's a news piece, and sometimes things get changed, and it's actually it turns an accurate piece to an inaccurate piece and it's not anything to say against editors. It's just, or even like sub-editors, it's that the story a little bit better. And then sometimes mistakes are made. But then often, I get something changed at a time, and I think actually that's probably a better way of constructing that sentence. So it's not too bad. What doesn't happen though is analysis pieces don't get changed, because so nobody's going to insert a different opinion to yours into your copy, because that's sacrosanct as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Well, one of the things though that they've done to screw me over again and again
is you're always just screwed over by the establishment, aren't you?
That's it. They're out to get me. But one of the things, because I suppose not knowing the process and coming in with a host of misconceptions about it, it was just very surprising to me. And that was one of the reasons I found it difficult to navigate these relationships, because I was like, hey, what the fuck are you doing? And they were like, this is protocol, and I was like, you can't be doing that. But is give it these headlines, so very much sensational headlines. The article that got me into trouble, most of the outrage was about the fucking headline.
That happens all the time. You find actually in Twitter, a lot of journalist bios would be, journalist for FT or blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I do not write the headlines. Because that happens. I mean, I get messages
they don't
from
read
some
the articles
politicians.
anymore though either. People, a lot of the time.
Yeah, they
will
read the
the
first couple paragraphs, which is why that's why you're arguing over what the top line is, because you need to keep people interested, and also that's relevance is always the top line. But I've gotten messages from politicians and various people saying that caption was wrong, and I'm like, I know you're coming to me because I did the interview, but it's not my fault. And it's just it's the cut and thrust of it, really. It's not that. I don't think it's that problematic. It's not a reason to turn your back on it.
Yeah. I don't know. It's maybe I'll get more shit than you do. Maybe I'm thinner skinned. Maybe I'm a more sensitive person, Shona.
Oh yeah, that's true. That is another thing I would say. You have to have a thick skin. You have to have
it gives you a thick skin.
It gives you're thick. Your skin becomes thick, and you become probably more beaten and probably weather beaten and weathered, and maybe you're probably going to die earlier because it is quite a stressful job.
Well, insults that would have upset me
those insults
years ago don't bother me at all.
Well, there's also this competition. There is fierce competition. There's also the fact that with 24-hour news agenda, you have to be feeding the machine, creating news, and you've less time sometimes to concentrate on deeper issues or go deeper into certain subject matters as things evolve. Everything's become so much more global as well, so you're constantly chasing things. You could even say to yourself, I'm going to sit here and not even use the internet for an hour and a half and write this piece, and you come to the end of it and half of it's old. Because you do actually have to be constantly on but even that happens on the ground. I remember again when it happened in Gaza, I was sent in a report onto the radio, and then a phone call 2 minutes later. I was sent it thinking that's grand. That's them fed for 2 hours, and they said, oh, there was a bomb in the north of Gaza, Shajahi or something like that. 15 people killed, and I'm like, oh right, so that RAS report is out of date. And how would I have known that? Even though I'm on the ground, the news desk knew before me, because sometimes you're just on the ground as well. So it's that, and that's very stressful, because you feel like no matter what you do, no matter how awake you are for 20 hours of the day or 18 hours a day, you still can't compete with the fact that the news wires and other people have news earlier than you.
Yeah, so the immediacy of it has just completely changed the game. Like, how long did it take? People would be working on a piece for weeks sometimes, I suppose, before, and then it would appear, and there wasn't this concern about immediacy. Like, I suppose standards have slipped, I would venture, but at the same time, I'm amazed that standards have been maintained at all when people are trying to put out stories within the hour.
Yeah, standards I don't think standards have slipped necessarily, to be
honest. In terms of writing, for example.
It's very difficult to write, you have to write so quickly and make sure. I would actually say things have got harder, standards haven't slipped. Actually, it's a much more difficult job to do. And
it's that's it. So I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive.
The only problem is when mistakes happen, and they do, of course they do, the first thing that people blame and can blame is the fact that the journalist needed to get something out quicker, and sometimes the protocol for double checking, that wasn't adhered to properly, and then therefore something got out, and always it's the immediacy element which was the priority rather than the quality element.
Have defamation claims gone up because of that?
That's a good question. I don't know. No, but I'm not. No, I don't think so. We would get everything legal before it's printed anyway,
right.
and it would be withheld or altered in some way. And anything that would, so even if you're tweeting something that's going online, it would still have to be legal if there was anything remotely controversial about it. So I don't think so in that regard, actually.
What do you think of the defamation laws here as opposed to the States?
Yes.
Do you think they should be strengthened, weakened, or changed in a different direction?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Again, I think obviously they are very strong, and I do actually believe in the right to privacy and the right to people to maintain a good name.
Well, as a journalist on the other side of the mirror now, to an extent, because it's easy to defame a journalist as well now.
Exactly.
It can be done straight away.
It's disproportionately probably weighed in favour of journalists being inhibited from doing their jobs. But at the same time, the United States is quite squalid, and so is the UK. Even though the UK has really quite strong defamation laws, because we get our laws.
But they have a culture of
their
tabloid culture that is a bit more pugilistic than we have.
I think their press is sometimes just beyond irresponsible. The Telegraph had a piece the other day. 51% of people say that Theresa May has engaged in treason. And do you agree?
In a threesome?
No, in treason. And trying to drum up this hatred of her and drum up this anger that she's somehow a detractor or a subversive against the United Kingdom, even though the woman isn't. I'm not a fan of Theresa May, but she's definitely not trying to subvert the country. She's actually under a huge amount of pressure trying to balance so many competing and very, very complex issues. And people forget that Jo Cox, a wonderful Labour MEP, lost her life over a political argument. And here they are trying to drum this up, calling the Supreme Court saboteurs. I think this is it's very, very dangerous language, and also it's factually inaccurate.
Yeah, I suppose I'd actually agree with you to the extent. I wouldn't have the reservation to say about the Supreme Court, but I think the personalisation of politics is bad for a number of reasons. First of all, people can become scapegoats
to call people saboteurs because they made a resolution or came to a conclusion based on law.
I'll explain the distinction that I'm drawing, because I'm not necessarily claiming that that's accurate, but I'm saying there's a big difference between going after institutions and people. So I think the personalisation of politics is bad for a number of reasons. It's bad because it can destroy people's lives and they become scapegoats.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes with the Barry McElduff thing, for example. Okay, I'm not going to rehearse the things of it, but if you give him the benefit of the doubt, which I think everybody should be afforded, it could be interpreted as completely accidental and completely without malice.
I think take that.
And his career is ruined. 30-year career in politics ruined over it.
But hold on a minute. And I agree with you there.
Let's not talk about Barry McElduff.
No, but what kind of niche does go around stuff on his head anyway, I mean, I know that it wasn't just a loaf of bread. He had Mars bars in his head, he had a washing machine in his head, he had a Snickers bar in his head. So we know that he has a history and a catalogue of photos with him putting things in his head.
Yes.
But do you want a man who goes around with a catalogue of himself representing it? It was a very stupid thing to do.
That might be a bad example.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is the other thing, I suppose, the other problem with it, not just that it can ruin individuals' lives, it's that it draws the focus away from systemic change, and I think it's systemic change that we need. I think we saw that with the guards. We got rid of Martin Callanan. I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I called Callanan a blustering buffoon in print. And stuff like this, but realistically, his departure made absolutely no difference.
Really
Same with Noreen O'Sullivan.
Yeah.
And now we've got a Securocrat in who has sinister connotations, for sure.
That's
if the focus had been on that systemic change rather than the personalities involved, we could have had much better outcomes. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. I would dissociate myself from that remark in relation to sinister connotations, because I think that you have to give people a chance, but. And I'm not saying what you're saying is that people. I understand where you're coming from with your criticisms. I just wouldn't agree with that necessarily. But you're right. We feel that once we get rid of the main perpetrator, whether it's Callanan, Shatter, Norrie, so then we go, that's great, we've got that head rolled, and then we move on. And then the government gets away with saying we've given the people a head. And we're giving them one on the guillotine, whatever it is, and therefore let's carry on as normal. When actually, in fact, we know that it's the departments that need to be completely changed culturally and in every other way, from a civil servant perspective, from the advisors, and particularly with the Gardaí. Absolutely. I mean, it's not even about the whistleblowers. Well, it is, was a lot of it to do with the whistleblowers. So, but you look at things like domestic violence in this country, and the number. And I've done a lot of work with women who are the victims of that, and not invariably, but so many times they would say that the Gardaí just kind of ignored the situation, thought of it as a domestic. But if they'd seen a man and a woman in any other circumstance, they would say that's assault. But then they are called to a home, and they're like, look, we don't want to engage here, we don't know what to do. And often those cases were never listed as assault. They were just sort of, shied away from when it came to prosecuting the men. And so that's just one element, and there's so many other layers to it. So again, we get ahead and then we think things are going to change, and they never do. And so that's the problem with just pinpointing and personalising things. So
I remember seeing you, it's a good while ago as well, on the ground in Mosul, in Iraq. So it kind of prompted me to think a little bit about what was your best experience, worst experience, most crazy. So we might take it in that order. So what's been your best experience as a journalist?
God, that's really interesting. Like, sometimes I suppose it's a difficult word, best, because sometimes the most, let's say, the issue or the thing that you covered the most, that maybe affects you the most, is probably not the best experience. Yeah. But actually, one thing you probably don't think I was going to say is that the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, when Trump became the nominee, that was incredible. It was one of the most incredible periods ever that I've ever covered. And so
I suppose you're drawing the distinction that sometimes an experience might be thrilling as a journalist, but it's actually a pretty fucking bad state of affairs.
It was really bad. I mean, normally, what's interesting about it is it contradicts this narrative that the people who voted with Trump are all working class, uneducated, from the Rust Belt, because the people that go to these things are very wealthy. It's very expensive to go to them. You have to be invited. You have to pay your dues to the Republican Party and generally be a donor. And so you're talking about people who are attorneys general from parts of Texas and senior lawyers, highly educated people. And at the time, Trump that was the grabber by the pussy tape. These are people who see themselves as real conservatives. So, but yet they're going to defy, their own principles for the sake of this man. But most importantly, then you had, women who should know better, but men should know better too, going around with these T-shirts that said, "Hillary sucks, but not like Monica," which is actually really offensive. And the lock her up thing. I was at this event. It was sort of on the margins event with Chris Christie, who's a governor of New Jersey, who's a prosecutor, who was hoping for the job of Attorney General at the time, he's a lawyer, and he was rallying the crowds and whipping up hate, not support for Donald Trump, more hatred against Hillary Clinton, and saying things like, what's she guilty of? Corruption. No, he had a list of things, and he was saying corruption, and he'd get the crowd to say guilty. And then, whatever, Libya, and, being a bad Secretary of State, they'd get more and more angry, and they'd say guilty, and then he'd go, come on, everybody, lock her up. And the lock her up thing wasn't just about the lack of regard for due process from a man who wants to be Attorney General, but the mob rule element and the violence that actually, there's an air of violence that comes with the idea that you just lock a person up, your opponent up. It's quite fascistic as well, and they had normal right-thinking members of society saying, get this woman out, let's lock her up and throw her in front of the guillotine, pretty much. That was actually quite offensive because there was nothing intelligent about it, nothing factual about it. It was like, let's just throw any sort of values out the window when it comes to this political environment. And then you had Donald Trump calling on Putin to release her 30,000 emails. And then generally just the sort of buffoonery that was going on, you know, which was actually very amusing. There was a lot of music and, you know, drinking and dancing and stuff, and that was quite wild too. So amid like this, you know, mob rule, there was also just like people playing a lot of country and western music. And then when and there was people bawling their eyes out when they saw Donald Trump, as if the Messiah had returned to them. And again, some of them, these people are, you know, Baptists and people who, you know, really are true conservatives to the letter and the law of, maybe, I wouldn't say Christian values, because I don't see these people as Christians, to be honest with you. I see these people as betraying Christian values, people who are anti-refugee, people who are anti-immigration.
But they would be social conservatives in the sense of sexual politics, for example, or gender politics.
Yeah, we know that.
Yeah, Trump isn't that.
Well, a conservative would also be someone who would like to see themselves as respected.
Sorry, they would be moralistic. Yeah, do you know what I mean? So you would expect
no
exactly. Yeah, so it's a different. Trump is a departure in that sense. He's not. He doesn't present an outward, you know, vision of propriety.
No, not at all. I mean, he's had 2 divorces. You know, 3. You know, I mean, I don't have a problem with that. I'm an absolute.
Yeah, of course, but it's hypocritical.
It's totally hypocritical, and then they know that he's not a true conservative. But then again, they know he'll push through their reform when it comes to tax, and he'll probably, because he's got no actual ideology, he'll probably get rid of Roe versus Wade, which is something that they want as well. But in terms of the American values, the values that they purport to want to protect, that man is not the man to protect them.
Yeah, for sure.
And then there's the Christian evangelist element, which something that annoys me so much, this right-wing agenda where they believe they have the monopoly over Christianity, and they're the people who will condemn refugees, condemn, you know, African Americans, you know, who are anti, let's say, social welfare or reforms to social welfare, Planned Parenthood, helping poor women, but yet they'll insist that they have babies that they probably can't afford. Anyway, that's just like that just sort of differs. But I remember just seeing that whole period, like so much of what I thought was great about America, you know, was sort of shrinking before my eyes. So that was quite fascinating, and I still haven't gotten over it, actually. You know, then that just built up to the whole trajectory of him eventually becoming president. You know, was I just thought, wow, there's something has really, really changed here, and it was a real vision. But then there's been other circumstances. You know, I remember in the Democratic Republic of Congo covering specifically the issue of rape as a tool of war, and it was some of the most harrowing stories that you'd ever hear. And it's a very complex conflict, and it's one of those stories and one of those places that Irish people would never really have a close consciousness with.
Well, we had soldiers in the Congo, didn't we?
Yeah, we did, and we do have lots of soldiers in Africa, true, but in terms of the day-to-day, and it's also a quite impenetrable conflict because there's so many layers and so many different militants. And the reason why people should probably know about it is because, you know, it's mineral rich. It's also got coal tar, which is the main ingredient for making mobile phones, which is also one of the reasons why there's so much war there. But what I was covering was the number of women who are raped on a daily basis by militants, whether they're the Congolese soldiers themselves or former genocidaires from the Rwanda genocide who hid there after the Rwanda genocide, or other militants. And I was in North Kivu, South Kivu, actually, near Bukavu, and so the women I was speaking to had been, let's say, raped within days or maybe a week, and had just returned from hospital. So it was a constant thing. It wasn't a legacy story. And, you know, Congo is one of these places. There's no such thing as roads or no phones. There are mobile phones, but actually where I was, you couldn't even get internet reception. You couldn't, and even when you tried to pinpoint where you were, it's like you would come up that's not actually on the map. You know, so you're so far removed. And I remember we were staying in this little tiny little cottage, and it was near a field hospital. And generally what happens is these soldiers and militants, they're living in the woods, which is where we were, and they come in and they use their machetes, they rape women, they kill them, chop them up, whatever. I mean, it's incredibly violent. You know, some of the stories that they would use caustic soda and insert them into women's vaginas, and they rape 2-year-olds and 85-year-olds, you know, really, really extreme stuff. And I was with 2 women from the DRC, and Salome was one of them. And I remember she's such a calm person. And that night, it was so silent, and then suddenly there was this howling, and just women howling, and I just thought, oh my God, that's so close. And it was probably only 11 o'clock at night, but it was pitch dark, completely pitch dark. And we have this tiny little cottage that we're in, and I went in to wake her up, you know, to say, hopefully for her to reassure me that everything's okay, but she did not.
Yeah.
She's like, oh, yeah, that's not great.
Yeah.
And so we stood there, and I remember I was in my pajamas, had my passport, my phone in my hand. I was just standing there, like, you know, frozen, because to jump out the window one way would just be going in the direction of the jungle. Or what do? Stay in the cottage and hope nothing happens.
Yeah.
Or like, where could you go? We've got no car. Or
yeah.
So anyway, in the end, I said to her, I said, there's a guy at the door, does he have a gun? You know, as if I even, you know, was that some form of defense that we might have? And she said, nobody's got a machete. And I'm like, that's great. We're in for, that's really going to defend us. So it was really, I remember thinking, well, this could be it. And in the end, thankfully, some local chief had died. He was elderly, so it was fine. He wasn't murdered or anything. And they were sort of just singing about his death. Keening
people
about
would
his
in the west of
death.
Ireland.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So that's what it was about. But he went and found out. But it was a good 25 minutes before he found out what was actually happening, and that we knew that, you know, we weren't in danger. And so that story, or those people that I spoke to, you know, they're just astonishing. What happens to those women, and the response from the international community is very little. And actually, unfortunately, within their own community, because actually to be raped is there's a huge stigma around it.
Yeah.
So when women get raped, they're often ostracized from the community. Some of them just end up starving, you know, because they're not allowed back in the community to harvest, you know, agricultural products or anything. And so, I mean, it was just the things that we consider problems in life, you know, and then actual problems.
So I had an uncle that was in the French Foreign Legion for years. I don't know if I ever talked about that today. No. And
I think you might have actually.
Yeah, he was in Djibouti. He was stationed there. But then after he finished, he bought a pub in the Costa del Sol for a while and chilled out there, having a good time. But then he went back to Burundi, and one of the things that he found it difficult to emphasise to me, or he found it contradictory, because on the one hand he was saying, you know, Burundi had the Hutus and Tutsis as well as Rwanda, and, you know, these kind of problems, and you know, I suppose, like, you're mentioning the level of trauma that people have suffered. But then he was saying as well that, you know, oftentimes there were much happier people than we are in the West. He felt, you know, and he preferred being around Africans than me or Westerners, you know. He had, after spending, because he spent a large proportion, he spent more of his life abroad now than he has in Ireland, because he left when he was a teenager. So have you found that at all? So, you know, one of the things is they say during wartime depression goes down. Incidents of depression and suicide go down during war. Right. Have you found anything like that, or any kind of surprising spirit in,
is that the case?
Or joy amongst horror, you know?
Amid horror, like, I guess. No, I mean, it's all relative though, isn't it? I mean, you can obviously say when people don't have these overreaching expectations that are based on, you know, goods and, you know, inanimate objects, then striving for just to keep up with the Joneses is probably not going to really fill your heart or your soul. So, you know, in times of economic boom, when people are obsessed with property prices, then it's probably, you get a lot more anxiety when you don't reach that level, and other people are, because they feel that is what decides whether you're a failure or successful. And so I think that's one thing that we have to contend with in the West, particularly in a booming economy. And then I guess when you're in a situation where you're poor, you're maybe closer to your family, community, those things are much more important because you rely on each other. That's one element. However, in a war zone and in conflict zones, people are so demoralized that the only thing they have is maybe their honor, for example.
Yeah.
And, you know, the small car they have, or the small house they have. But their honor is so much important, because that's the only thing that they, you know, can say that defines them in a positive way. And what if that is removed or dented in some way, they've got nothing. And what that leads to often is if your family member dishonors you or dishonors your family in some way, then it leads to violent onslaught. And a lot of honour killing, for example, to women evolves from that. Women, their daughters end up marrying or falling in love with them, whether it's a soldier from the enemy's line, or
we saw that in the north as well, where women were tarred and feathered for fraternising with British soldiers.
Exactly, happened in the Second World War. You know, women had their heads shaved, but also it might not even be as strong as that. It might be just somebody from a different religious sect. Could be a Muslim against a Christian, or vice versa,
or a Sunni against Shia.
Exactly right. Yep. And then you have women. Women's morality is actually, you know, the key to the family's honour, and then women get killed. So, and I think that's a real problem. And actually, it's the same thing that happened in Ireland too. You look at the Magdalen laundries. Because women's morality was the key focus of the Catholic Church when it came to whether or not you were respectable or had respectability. Your daughter then was going to tear away or eat away, or her actions were going to in some way dilute your family's honour. Well, then you get rid of her, because you can't have that. And then people felt compelled to get rid of their daughters, send them to Magdalen laundries. Why? Because of honour, because the Catholic Church and the state said, we'll decide what's respectability, and women, single women having babies and being pregnant is not it.
Well, my ma, you know, got pregnant with me when she was 17 or whatever, and they tried to have her sectioned to get me adopted, you know, with that, and that's 81. So even later on, people tend to think of this as an old phenomenon. You know, there was still this massive stigma, just like you say, attached to that kind of morality, and attached to the social integration on one level seems like a positive thing, but then the oppressive nature of attaching a family's honour to a woman's sexual morality or whatever, you know, has those implications. You know, I suppose it reminds me. I was having this discussion with a historian, and I was saying 1922 Ireland. Like, I was looking at pictures that my granny had in her house, and the amount of nuns, like in the background, you know, and clergy just walking around.
Everywhere.
Every family. It was the main son would inherit the farm, you know, the peasants, and then the second one would be a priest, and that was your
that was
goal.
Also delivering some honour to a family as well, if you had some priesthood.
Reputation,
and then also women from like a lot of nuns, like Mary Robinson always tells this story about how she was going to become a nun after school, not because she was very religious, as we know, she fought very strongly against the Catholic Church,
but to have
a career that involved travelling. And, you know, being independent and sort of going around, traveling the world, being on the ground, being amongst men, probably single men, or, you know, men who are maybe seen as you know, unpleasant or whatever, and to do that, then to do that in a way that could remain virtuous and without maybe people
without having to have a chaperone, because
then you'd be a nun.
Yeah, absolutely. The comparison I used then was like, and I don't think this is hyperbole. I know I can tend to slip into hyperbole, but was to Iran after the Iranian Revolution, and I think the theocracy was a similar level. I mean, the bishops had a hotline to the Taoiseach, and they had veto. Like, they could pull veto over any decision, and he would bow down. He would bend the knee to them. Do you think that's a fair comparison to Iran? Because you've been to Iran as well.
No, I haven't actually been to Iran.
No. Oh, okay. You've been everywhere else in the Middle East.
No, but it's a fair comparison in terms of the interaction, the level playing field that the clergy had with the. Actually, I'd say that the political establishment bowed down to the clergy. There were cases where the politicians and ministers had made decisions, and then they get called into the office of the
McQuaid's, for example, down to the palace, not even an office, palace that he had down
and then told to scrap one policy, particularly when it came to medical. Health provision.
So you're thinking of Noel Brown?
I was trying to think of his name there. Noel Brown, yeah.
Just for people that don't know, because we might have a few foreign listeners.
So Noel Brown was a Minister for Health who tried to have a scheme for mothers and babies, and it was about women independently being able to establish what was right for them and their children, and it probably would have helped single mothers as well. And so it was about women focused.
What about this TB eradication down and anything like this?
But mainly the point was that he saw women as equal, and that maybe they should have their own sort of agency when it came to their health provision. And that was something that the Catholic Church could not abide.
But it was very, very mild stuff that he wanted. I mean, the concept
about it,
precisely,
But also, if you give women education, if you give women their rights, if you give women
and contraception, suddenly
babies, their birth rate falls.
And but there's loads of positive knock-on effects to, for example, societally giving women control over their own fertility.
Exactly, the impact is babies. The number of babies obviously falls, but also if you give women ideas about independence, and especially to the state, that they may not need then husbands. Not that any woman wants to shy away from if they want to getting married.
Yeah.
But the point would be that they wouldn't feel compelled to do it. They could feel, well, actually, maybe I could do this on my own, like your mom did.
Yeah.
And so you give them ideas about that, and then what happens to the family unit?
Yeah, like this is one of the things.
They're well fought, and they were right, by the way. The Catholic Church was absolutely right. You give women independence and control over their own bodies, and of course they're going to make these decisions because that's what self-determination is all about. But they just didn't like it, but they were right, and it didn't help the Catholic Church, but that's not what we're here for.
One of the things that has taken, I never had faith in the mainstream media, but as really kind of hammered home my preconceptions about it. Hear me out here.
Solidified,
yeah. Was Brexit and Trump, not in terms of whether the rights and wrongs of the situation, but in terms of the pundits being adamant that neither was going to happen, that it was impossible.
Yeah.
And then I was just like, why are these people still on the fucking telly? They don't know what they're talking about. If this fellow was manager of a hedge fund, he'd be fucking buried. His
Probably
career
not,
would be
actually.
over.
Probably not.
You'd probably have a bonus. Yeah, you're right. But if let me think of another line of
No,
work.
but I know what you mean. You're right.
Yeah.
The pollsters might as well just pack up and go home.
Yeah.
When it came to Trump, when it came to Brexit, and actually even our own last referendum, most of the
this
polls
is
were
the
saying
thing.
sort of 50-55%.
But I suppose I thought it could have been a shock in terms of, I felt that Brexit and Trump and everything was a reaction to the failure of liberalism in a lot of ways, right? And the abandonment of the working class worldwide by neoliberalism, right? And this is not if we're going to go.
No, but I don't think that's something people argue with.
So I thought Pat McCabe wrote an article, and I remember my mum was out canvassing every night, and I remember saying to her, Jesus, this might go the other way, and she was adamant. No, she was sure that it was going to be, very large result. So, do you think that, were you concerned that there would be that kind of Trump Brexit effect of no, we're going to fuck the political class?
Yeah, but this is a different thing because this wasn't the political class. This was fucking the political class anyway, because the political class was what gave us the 8th Amendment in the first place.
Yeah, of course.
So nobody was going to, so people were united in that this was something that was beyond politics.
But because Liberals were behind it,
well then,
I thought there might have been a reaction against that.
Well, I mean, if they did, then that is... How thick is thick?
Of course.
And I'm sorry, but that is just that. But you're in some way you're right. But just because the political class behind something, that doesn't mean it's straight away wrong. And
of course, I know that.
And if you choose to maybe reject something just because the political class is, and it's for your benefit, then again,
I know that, but I thought.
No, I didn't think that at all.
Yeah.
I would have thought that. My worry was the turnout, and that the older people would vote in favour of retaining.
Yeah, and older people always vote much better.
Exactly, but I felt that there was enough. I thought, in fairness, the date was set maximise the turnout in terms of students and in terms of the leaving cert, in terms of even the weather, all of those things. They allowed for maximisation of the vote, so you couldn't argue with that element. And no, but I also thought, there's so many women that I have interviewed over the years that were either in mother and baby homes or marriage homes, or even, let's say, my mother and her friends, who they wouldn't be, let's say, uber pro-choice or anti-abortion or anything, but they've understood that this country has not done the best for women, and women, have to make these choices, and it's not black and white. And unfortunately, whether you agree with abortion or not, sometimes a woman decides the best thing for her, depending on the circumstance, fetal abnormality, and other issues. And the 8th Amendment was just so restrictive on all of those issues that it just confined women to, even more trauma, and it actually didn't prevent abortion. And I'm not rerunning the referendum. What I'm saying is that people have had lives for decades, and they've seen, whether they're midwives, they've seen friends in tears over babies that were wanted but then couldn't be born in the way that they had hoped, or just seeing things happen in life. and that it isn't black and white. And they just said, you know what, I'm gonna be a silent, repeal. And I think that's what happened, because if you look at Roscommon, which as we know is a Conservative constituency, they voted 60% in favour of repeal.
That's amazing.
And everyone thought that was an indicated constituency. Everyone thought, how much are they going to vote against? And it was overwhelming, because again, and I spoke to doctors, local GPs from around those areas, and they said, I knew it, because I had patients over the years who come in and say, look, I have a serious problem from abortion pills, or I need help because I need counselling after an abortion, and he's like, you wouldn't believe the amount of people that I know, local people who have had abortions or who felt they should have allowed to have access to one, and it's sort of followed them all through their life. And he said, I knew those people were always going to vote yes, but maybe publicly or when they're talking to their next door neighbour, they wouldn't have been so open about it.
Yeah. And I suppose it is very different in terms of it was much more of a social issue than about political power.
Yeah.
But do you think that the pundits are out of touch? Like, I've been on TV shows and I've been feeling like saying, listen, why are we listening to this fella? He doesn't know what he's fucking talking about any more than I do. He was wrong he's been wrong on everything. I mean, okay, so maybe not if you were a stockbroker, but if you were working on Paddy Powers, you would be fucked out the door for having that record on putting odds on stuff.
Yeah,
so,
I wonder why. Because obviously what happened here was a silent yes rather than a silent no. But then people knew it was socially unacceptable, really, to vote for Donald Trump, and for obvious reasons. Because his behaviour was quite reckless, and he clearly doesn't, on the face of it, have, or even in reality have, what it takes to be a reasonable leader. So it was socially unacceptable. People did it because they felt like that's something visceral, like they wanted something to change, and they thought he's going to disrupt the system. So I'll ignore all of these this concern I may have with them, but I actually want this man to do what he says he's going to do, which is maybe return the steel back to Pittsburgh and return the glory days of the post Second World War era in the United States, which it's not a real aspiration to have, but people just wanted it.
I wonder if there wasn't an element of just despair and being okay. We have a choice between the status quo and the status quo except a fuck you to the media and the political class. I suppose this brings me to another question or statement that you can respond to. I've been in Leicester House a few times. On a digressive note, every time I've been in there, I've seen Danny Healy-Rae choosing a fucking cake. And he's hovered over the pastry section, like looking with a torment on his face before picking the apple crumble or whatever. But what I also saw was journalists, the editors of top newspapers, talking in very, very overly friendly manners to journalists, or to politicians. I saw top level Fine Gael politicians having their lunch with Fianna Fáil politicians. I remember I was walking in and
I've never seen that myself, but anyway, go on.
Yeah, I was walking in and Micheál Martin pushed past me, and my girlfriend at the time said, oh, there he is, rushing in to abstain. But I felt that it looked very sinister to me, the relationship between the media and the political class in there, in terms of how intimate they were. Not necessarily, I understand keep it collegiate and not be a shrieking lunatic, but I've met politicians in green rooms and things like this, and I find it hard then to
be mean to them then.
Yeah, to be as mean as I should be.
Yeah, because
they fucking deserve it.
Yeah, because we're all human.
Listen, they deserve it. But do you think those relationships are unhealthy? Do you think, like, I suppose people don't know about them as well? The public doesn't know. They see the Dáil reporter as sitting in his chair up on the fucking thing and then writing about what's been said in the Dáil, when really he's having whispers in the corridor.
Well, I mean, whispers aren't corridors. How you find out what the political party
But
is
when you
thinking.
become friends with someone, when you're drinking with them, when you're...
become friends with them. I mean, everybody knows that, or everyone should know, that there's a limit to how close you can become with a politician. But then sometimes friendships evolve, and you can't turn around and say just to make the point, you can't turn around and say, well, you're not going to do a good job because you're friends with that person who happens to be a politician either. If you're going to be a journalist, then your record will have to show that you're willing to, when it's the right time and for the right reasons, to absolutely disrupt the political class and write stories that are against the government or against a particular party, and we should all be in agreement that that's for the greater good and for the public interest, and that's your job, and any politician should recognise that too. That goes without saying. It is important, you know, that there is a division in that regard, and of course lines probably get crossed every now and again, because if you end up seeing somebody down
lines
the pub
probably get done. There was cocaine found in the toilets in the Doll bar, but did you hear that? Yeah, there's a story on that. It was pulled in. They did a swab test and stuff.
Well, that was a good few years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, but listen, it's endemic. Anyway, I would say that primary school teachers don't fraternise with their pupils, and I prefer to see the relationship between the media and politicians.
Primary school teachers and pupils is not a fair comparison.
It's a good analogy.
The thing is, you do need to, in order to make stories or to have an idea if there's some dissent within the Fianna Fáil party, the Fine Gael party. And by the way, these are sometimes they're kind of like, you know, bubble yarns as well. But if you think there may be a heave in the offing, for example, against any particular party leader, you need to talk to the grassroots and the backbenchers, because they're the ones who are always normally the ones who are
more keen to.
Well, they're more keen to have their voices heard, and because they're often muted by the top layer of the party, and they're also the ones who become more disaffected because the voices haven't been heard. So they're the ones that you need to talk to say, well, look, are you going to cobble together some sort of group who's anti the leader here? You just need to know what's going on in the grassroots, and it's relevant at times when, for example, now we have the confidence and supply agreement up for renegotiation, and to know whether or not the grassroots or the backbenchers are going to support a renegotiation of that, or that the party, Fianna Fáil, pulls the plug after the next budget and then decides to go for an election. Because obviously journalists want to be the first to say the general election is going to be here, and that's how we prepare for it. And those stories are important. But, I mean, they're yards. But you know, there's other stories like that politicians will have a report from a paper or, you know, a classified document, and they'll give it to certain journalists and to get it leaked, and they're important in the public interest too. So everybody has to wash themselves in those relationships, but they do happen, and it's a part of life. And you just said it yourself.
Wash themselves. They have to wash themselves after they talk to them.
But you said it yourself. If you do regularly contribute to panel shows, and if you were meeting the same politician, even if he was from, let's say, a centrist or a right wing party. Yeah. And I know you find it difficult that you actually like the person.
I found Noel Rock very personable, and it was traumatic experience to me, finding him. Like, he was a nice fucking guy, and it was hurtful. But I suppose I would venture. Listen, I've been fed a story before and collaborated with someone on getting a story up. And I had no qualms about doing that. And you know, if it came to
a politician.
But
exactly.
But
in the public interest.
But I would say that I announce myself as a political actor. You know, I announce my politics. You know, and I have an agenda, and I'm pushing that agenda vociferously. Whereas I think there's an illusion maintained of impartiality, and I think if you dispensed with that, it might be a lot better.
No, because I think it's unfair. Like, I mean, when I was reporting on the Oireachtas Committee, the 8th Amendment, there's no way that you could say that my reportage of that committee was in one way pro repeal or not. It was factually based reportage, and so that's what your job is, and that's what you have to do to be trusted and to have credibility. So I don't think there's any need for people to come across and talk about their political activism. And also, I don't think you should be a journalist in the Oireachtas, you know, covering politics if you're an activist, because then clearly you're going to be biased and have an agenda, and that's not in the public interest.
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose what I would say though is that there's a tendency towards not just in terms of building a friendly relationship, but reciprocality. Because if someone is feeding you very valuable, juicy stories, you want to keep them sweet naturally. Yeah. So that can certainly develop into an unhealthy dynamic. And it's happened a million and fucking one times. And you know what I saw, seeing an editor cozying up to a politician, they were thick as thieves.
Well, you don't know what conversation they were having anyway, you know.
But do you think that, specifically, within crime journalism, I mean, the reporting, and I know this, you know, the reporting of on the guards has been a fucking disgrace, a stain upon the profession. You saw the two fellas getting shot over the past year, unarmed men, were shot. Have you heard about those stories? No. There was one Eastern European guy down in the country somewhere, and a guard shot him in the face. He hadn't got a weapon on him, and it was reported on the day as an accidental discharge of the firearm, without attribution to Gardaí say this is an accidental discharge. This is on a national broadcaster. Okay, now it would be impossible for the reporter to know that.
To ascertain
and
that.
Sitting here, without, de facto not knowing anything about the situation, I can tell that was irresponsible reporting.
Okay.
Before and after the fact. Huh?
Did you come make a complaint?
I fucking went bleeding mad all over Twitter.
Well,
I probably should have made it. Yeah, I should have made a formal complaint. But that happened again. Then there was a case in around Portobello where a guard came upon people in the car and shot a fella, and he was shot in the arm. And again, it was reported very favourably towards the guards' line prior to any inquiry. We're supposed to have an unarmed police force. Now, within crime reporting, they rely on Gardaí giving them stories at individual discretion. And we've seen the biggest case of corruption, and they're putting out stories so favourable to the guards, still like this, and they still have the brass balls to go and tell you and say something was an accident prior to any inquiry. And they also smeared the fella as known to Gardaí. Now this to me speaks of a deep pathology in the relationship between journalists and the Gardaí. What do you think about that?
I really never work in crime journalism. I don't know the inner workings of it at all, so I can't comment on that. And I think it would be kind of unfair because I don't know the details of it.
Yeah.
I do think that it's important for everyone. It kind of goes back to our story or our conversation about people from certain parts of Ireland who may have actual sources within not just gangland, but kids who know a little bit more about what happens in those communities and why it evolves that certain young men or young women decide to get into criminality. The fact is that we don't have many people from those communities in journalism, so the reliance is then on other type of sources, because often, as we saw with people like Veronica Guerin, engaging in it in such a manner which is at the front line cost her life, and so that's quite difficult. So obviously for me and for any other journalist, sources are vital, but sources should also be broad and within various different elements of the story.
I suppose though it's emblematic to a sense of what I'm talking about is not just the fact that the reporting was so reckless. It is the fact, saying that the shooting was accidental, unless you're an eyewitness, without attribution of that source, that's reckless journalism.
You should have complained about it, because in fairness, I don't know the incident that you're talking about, but I don't think that's consistent. I do think that journalists do their best, and I think a lot of the conspiracy theories about mainstream media are unfounded.
Oh, absolutely, and this is the thing as well. Conspiratorial thinking pervades a lot of kind of leftist thought, and I think it's completely contrary to, for example, Marxism, which said this is an impersonal system. Again, back to the personalisation of politics. But again, I suppose, forgetting how the story was reported, you haven't heard those stories until I just told you about them. Now, we had Black Lives Matter, we had Irish liberals, we had prominent Irish leftist journalists, talking about Black Lives Matter a lot. And our unarmed police force were shooting unarmed men, and it garnered no publicity. You're working in that environment, and you haven't heard about those stories.
Yeah, true. I do spend an awful lot of time away. I'm away.
I'm not getting at you. I'm getting at the people who haven't
reported. That's the thing, and it's right, and it's fair enough. But again, not everyone engages in that area. And of course, as a citizen of this state, I should take more of an interest in those stories in general, because actually, the gangland crime and crime in general affects us all. I guess it's just not from a journalistic perspective. Also, when you're working hard in different areas.
I'm not talking about gangland crime. I'm talking about Garda crime.
Okay, from Garda crime too, and then actually right. Then I hear about it about as much as everybody else, because I engage in it when it's mentioned in the Oireachtas, for example, and you've got really important issues regarding the whistleblowers and how they've been treated or mistreated, and how the service that they did for the state and for the Gardaí, as far as I'm concerned, was initially dismissed so heavily, and that's a worry.
Yeah. What do you think, I suppose, back to or not necessarily back to the conspiratorial kind of mindset, but there are pervasive misconceptions. Look, I think a lot of the criticisms from the left of the mainstream media are right. I think a lot of them are wrong.
Right.
And I think it's very hard for people on the outside to differentiate. But I think it's destructive, to.
So what's right then?
For example, the water protests. I was on those marches, and the numbers reported were wildly inaccurate. Wildly underestimated. Yeah. Forgetting for a moment the bias in terms of not having right to water spokespeople on when they have.
I don't know about that. I mean, again, it's a really interesting conspiracy theory because I actually covered that a good few times, and I can't tell you. My reports were basically only right to water people in them. Well, I went to Jobstown and covered it in relation to the last election, for example. And I spent the whole day with Jobstown, including the young guy who will remain named as Jay, right?
His name now. Yeah.
Okay, his name now. His colleagues, neighbours, you name it. Okay,
yeah.
And it was the context of Dublin South West constituency, and this part of it and how it would vote. And I mean, there was no discussion with my editor or the editors of the show I was working on, particularly in relation to any of the audio I used, and it was fair, and they said it was fair. But it was funny. The first thing they did, they were incredibly abrasive towards me initially, because they had this opinion of me,
particularly coming from the organisation you come from,
fine.
which is perceived as having a vested interest.
This is getting us nowhere. So I'm not even going to try and engage or entertain this. Let's get on with this. And I felt that and then we just moved on. We all gone great. The report was fine.
Jay says you were selling to me.
Yeah, grand. But my point is that I had to overcome so many hurdles of prejudice beforehand, which was just a little bit annoying. And I felt that this is just bullshit.
So you're saying it's not the media that's biased, it's the people?
Well, no, what I'm saying is they had this impression that I was out to get them somehow, and I wasn't.
And I accept that. Again, we're back to that conspiratorial mindset, and there is a diversity. I know for a fact there's a diversity of opinions within media organisations, particularly large media organisations. It would be impossible to retain homogeneity. There is an editorial line that gets pushed.
That wasn't never in my case.
I was caught reading Hard Cases by Jean Kerrigan, and the teacher sent the note home to me ma. But maybe I was I had premonitions that I was going to be involved in this kind of world.
It's so funny the way you go on about this. You keep calling yourself a retired journalist or an ex-con, and then you're then you're talking about yourself in the present tense as a journalist as well. So you haven't given up really.
It remains to be seen.
It's like as if you want us to beg you to stay.
Yeah, like someone who's leaving a party and they're like, oh no, I'm going home.
No,
stay,
Frankie. You bring so much to the table.
Maybe, I don't know. But so there isn't that homogeneity. But there was pre the last election, there was headline stories about Sinn Féin. I have 1,000,001 criticisms for Sinn Féin, trust me. But if you looked at the headline coverage, it was fucking disgraceful from The Independent. And you would be hard pressed to think of it as anything more than trying or anything less than trying to sway an election. Similarly, Paul Williams on the Late Late Show was an absolute fucking disgrace, talking about the Special Criminal Court and that. Amnesty and the Irish Council for Civil Liberties said they wanted to abolish the Special Criminal Court. Paul Williams went on the Late Show 2 weeks before the election and said, it's only the gangsters and drug dealers smirking on Francis Street that want the Special Criminal Court gone, and this is who Sinn Féin are in with, that kind of thing. So I would say those are real issues, those kind of things. And again, that doesn't require a massive conspiracy. It requires one editor or one journalist.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly.
Well, they're not recording the news so much as they're actors.
Well, they're all Mr. Columnists. I just know that we have the biggest team in the Indo is the political team, and everybody works to the best ability.
But one person decides what's going to be on the front page.
Not at all.
On the front page,
perhaps.
Yeah, on the front page.
Based on what's important.
5 or 6 days in a row was.
I don't remember that. I wasn't working at the time, so I just know that my team of political correspondents, political reporters, political editor, all the way up, we argue for only the best when it comes to a reportage that's balanced and fair and in the public interest.
Well, Chomsky would say that again he would veer away from the conspiratorial model, and I know you're familiar with manufacturing consent and things like that, and say, look, it only requires a few certain people, and not for them to be told top down what to do, but for the editors to be of a certain political persuasion, and then they will naturally They will, or not necessarily self-censor necessarily. Maybe the opposite. They won't self-censor enough.
Well, no, I just know that I understand where he's coming from in that, but because sometimes like I'm talking about maybe Fox News, for example, here, you know, there is a particular culture which tends to be incredibly pro-Republican, and it's also down to the laws, the defamation laws in the United States, where they get away with you know grotesque lies, whereas you just don't get away with that in Ireland. Nor should you, by the way, which is why I think that you can easily stand over your record.
Spin though, like you know, as a budding linguist and a semanticist, it's very easy to frame the same story in completely different ways.
Well, funny enough that you say that, because you know we're in silly season. It's time to get stories, and you know we have a hard-nosed editor who recognises when something is actually just being rehashed with a different top line, and that is generally rejected.
So spin is kind of generally accepted as having come into political parlance with Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell. Do you think that's true? Do you think?
I mean, that's because he was so good at it, Alistair Campbell, and also the thing is, it was a period where this wonderful period of transformation from the political system in the UK, because finally Labour were in power again. But Labour were also become mainstream, you know, in the eyes of, I guess, certain people, you know, because they moved away from maybe from the far left of the socialist model.
Because your man had a heart attack.
Just an observation anyway, you know, from it was from the days of Neil Kinnock, who failed to take over from the Tory party. The Tories were gone, and this was new Labour, and we had Blair's babes. Like, even the use of the words Blair's babes, like, it's actually very patronising. But at the time, it was accepted because at least he went as far as say we want so many women in cabinet, and he was, and Alistair Campbell, the People's Princess, and the two of them as a duo it gave people support in the Labour Party. It really up the game in terms of how people view the Labour Party. It's very progressive, very global, very open-minded, and sort of reinforce, you know, Britain's place in the world. It's very European, sophisticated, and then of course the Iraq War, you know, did away with all of that.
Well, yeah, that's so. I would say what you mean is that they were bourgeois, and yeah. Oh, we agree. I didn't think you were going to grant me that one.
Yeah, I think they were bourgeois. Yeah.
So my field in my academic life, which I want to return to or retreat into, is linguistics, but specifically written language. And I've written a lot about punctuation and things like this. And I was reading one of your articles, and one of the things that I really liked about it, and it sounds like a very surface level thing, was the use of the en dash. So that's the shorter dash spaced. And I picked up the use of the en dash from Francis Wheen. I don't know if you've heard of Francis Wheen. He's a UK journalist. He's written a fantastic biography of Marx. He's written How Mumbo Jumbo Conquered the World as well, before the whole fake news idea. But stylistically, he's one of my stylistic heroes. And I think it performs a really valuable function in putting in interpolated clauses within sentences. Do you know what I mean? I'd find it very difficult to write without using the dash.
Yeah, the dash, semicolon as well. I'm a big fan of semicolon. I do actually find myself overusing it at times. But yeah, because I also think that when you write, those sort of elements allow readers to see your train of thought. And so it's less formal, and I think it's much more, there's much more rhythm then to your writing. Yeah,
so I'd kind of argue in my academic work that that kind of punctuation is related, or it fills in gaps that we don't have in written, that we have in speech. So we can signal by intonation or by duration or by volume.
Yeah. So the flow is there, people can see that your train of thought and the rhythm is there. And even though you're still probably writing in a formal sense, especially when you're writing a news piece and it tends to be quite formal, there's an informal nature to it, because you're allowing people to see what it is that the natural nature, the natural progression of the sentences and where they fit in, and I suppose from the beginning, middle to the end of the story.
Yeah, precisely, and it communicates things that are present in speech but aren't there in writing. And you lose some meaning, you know, you lose some...
If you have a word like hard talk, hard without a dash talk, people would stumble upon that sentence, and then they've lost their train of, reading. And then they've also kind of got, where was I? So it just allows the flow.
Precisely, the example I like to use is the difference between...
Hard talk obviously came to mind because of this conversation that we're having.
This has been easy talk. This has been nice talk.
No, but generally you
we
and I
might call
tend
this
to have,
nice talk.
it's much more, I wouldn't say aggressive, but let's say robust
Me and you?
conversations. Yeah.
We do. We're lucky we haven't fallen out. I suppose both of us have
That's
thick
just
skins
for-
at this stage.
Yeah,
It's
but
par
also
for the
a
course.
healthy level of respect for proper debate.
Yeah.
On my side anyway.
The example I like to use with the hyphen stuff is for compound words is flower pot and hot dog. So a flower pot is a flower pot,
Yeah.
but a hot dog is not a hot dog.
Yeah.
So like that with hard talk, using it as an adjective rather than as a single compound word has a different connotation. I was surprised you mentioned the semicolon as well, because a lot of style guides now say just don't use it.
I know. I think it's necessary. If I had to just have one,
Thing that you're allowed.
yeah, then I would do the semicolon. I probably overuse it because I think it's just so useful because you don't have to end a sentence. Sometimes when you put a full stop in, it ends a sentence, but again, it cuts off the train of thought. So, and a colon obviously means that you have to show something that's quite definitive, whereas this is more, leads into this. It's better than it's stronger than a comma, but not as doesn't require so much definition as a colon.
Absolutely, and it's interesting talking to someone who probably hasn't studied this academically.
No.
But has learned it through practice rather than theory. So I suppose I'm not prescriptivist. I think language is defined by usage. But the rule I follow to allow me to use the semicolon correctly.
I feel like we're having a conversation at 5:30 in the morning. Because it's just one of those things you say. It's like when you start a sentence or a conversation with, it's interesting. It's interesting that you bring up the semicolon because you just that on a Monday evening.
I spent a year writing about ellipsis points.
I know, yeah.
So people would be very surprised by my monastic tendencies, let's say. But so the rule I follow with the semicolon, because people get very anxious about correct punctuation and things like this. A lot of time as well, you hear this grammar Nazis thing, and they're talking about punctuation. So they're not grammar Nazis; they're punctuation pedants, I like to call them. But the rule I follow is that if it could be grammatically split into two sentences, you can use a semicolon.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why then you don't have to intervene or end the sentence with the full stop and then start from a whole new, and it's much stronger. So you can get away with having a longer sentence as well. Kind of it's good to that.
The only positive I would take from editorial interventions was that I blamed a big faux pas that I made on an editor, and it was actually me. So
well, definitely. It would be arrogant to think that editorial intervention, sub-editor's intervention, generally speaking, isn't absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
Because often when you're also writing at speed, they're reading it as the first person who's obviously going to glance at it, and they are representing the person who's going to buy the newspaper, and they want to see something flow. And also, you make little mistakes here and there, and they need to be corrected.
Well, I said flagrant. Or no, I wrote a fragrant abuse of power, which means
instead of flagrant,
it's like nice smelling perfume.
Yeah, of course.
Instead of flagrant. And when someone pulled me up in it, I said, "Oh yeah, that was the
Or complimentary and complimentary as well.
Yeah.
Is something that I actually was on my way home about to get into bed, and for some reason I'd written the word complimentary, meaning COMPLE, and written it LI, and for some reason it came into my head, and it was like that episode of Father Ted where Dougal woke up, in the middle of the night and said, "Those women were in the nip." I was like, shit. I initially went, "Oh my god, I spelled complimentary wrong," and I haven't gone to print, so I rang up the editor. I was like, I don't know how this came into my head, but I know that I spelled complimentary wrong, so we changed that, and they did.
So have you ever made a mistake that you were embarrassed about? Or like, listen, I fucked up. I put something in that wasn't true, and I was pulled up in it, and I said, "Listen, I'll check it out," but I didn't kind of own the mistake maybe as much as I should. It was inaccurate reporting. So have you ever done that?
Wasn't inaccurate? I'm sure I have. We've all made little mistakes like that. But even just, I suppose if you're tired or something like that. I remember using the same word 3 times in a story, and it was just sloppy.
Yeah. And
you read it and you think, I wish somebody had picked that up, and maybe they were tired as well. And
my mate said
it annoyed me so much for like a long time. Even the first thing when you said that to me there, it's the first thing that came to my head. I still Yeah, it was really stupid. And it happens a lot, but sometimes mistakes are more sloppy than others.
My mate said he bought a bad thesaurus and it was rubbish, and it was also rubbish. But that overuse of a single word can
That is
jar.
definitely a half five in the morning comment, isn't it?
That overuse of a single word can definitely jar. But also, Steven Pinker says about thesaurus more seriously that it's like using a lump hammer fixing a bike. Be very careful of the destructive nature of this tool. And you'll see people, and you can tell that they have
just
gone to the thesaurus and it isn't the right sense, for example. You know.
And that actually happens a lot of the time. Where I sometimes write for some European publications, and they use the English language in a way that's almost correct but not quite, you know, and you're like, no, that tone is sort of wrong, and so it's like using a thesaurus when people don't know the actual, I suppose, when it's not a mother tongue, and you're not using it all the time, you can get it wrong. So
translation can cause major mishaps. It just reminds me, we were talking about Alistair Campbell earlier, and I wouldn't be a fucking Alistair Campbell fan myself, but he wrote a damn good novel once.
Oh, wasn't it? I remember that.
It was about someone having brain tumour or something like that. You know what I mean? But it was good, and it kind of, I think, referenced as well. You know, we talked about his own alcoholism and that kind of slip into madness. But it was surprisingly good. So a few politicians. Do you read memoir or books or fiction by politicians? Because a few politicians have tried to do this.
I haven't read any fiction by politicians.
Yeah, you haven't read?
Not that I have an aversion to it.
Well, have you read John le Carré, for example? I know that's not politician per se.
But that is somebody who was an actual spy who knows. Yeah, I mean, and you would read that. Actively, you would read something like that because you know that the story is, and often the truth is stranger than fiction anyway. And so you know that the material he's getting from there's going to be a grain of truth, and there's going to be detail in it that you're going to really enjoy. But I haven't shied away from reading Alan Chatter's book about his Julie Cooper book. If that's what you're asking, I just haven't had the opportunity.
If I could remember some of the quotes from that, you know, I got a bit of stick for the sex scenes in Dublin 7, but he took it to a whole other level. Bring it back to le Carré. You've met people from intelligence agencies on your travels, I'm sure.
Yeah, I have. Yes, former member of Al Qaeda actually. Who
former.
Yeah, but then he actually started working for MI5 and MI6. And now he actually works for some of the banks. He is a security expert, so he will do things like, look through records of certain organisations to see if they may be fueling terrorism. So look at pinpoint the direction and the journey where money is going. He's also an expert in intelligence, and he had joined Al Qaeda during the Bosnian War to support during the Yugoslav War to support. Bosnians, then he didn't join Al Qaeda. Then he became a member of Mujahideen, and then went to the Philippines, and then was asked to join Al Qaeda in Afghanistan in Kabul. And he also he told me some fascinating stories. He actually he was asked, and not everyone got to do this, but pledge an allegiance to Osama bin Laden. And he left Al Qaeda after the Nairobi bombings in the 90s. And part of the reason why, he's actually an Islamist scholar. He's not an Islamist fundamentalist, but he's an Islamist scholar. And he realized that the legal definition or the legal excuse that Al Qaeda used for blowing people up, but the excessive casualties, was actually theoretically wrong, because they see themselves as jihadists and Islamists, so they were able to use the Quran and Islam as a way of defending their actions. That it was legal in accordance with Islam, so therefore you're within the realms of Sharia law. Anyway, after much study, he thought, hold on a minute. I'm pretty sure Islam doesn't allow, I think at the time of these Nairobi bombings, it was about 200 people killed, several people blinded, and 12 Americans who were the targets because it was the US Embassy. And he at the time said, I'm all for, this sounds very glib, but he said, you're all for attacking America, but this is excessive death, and I'm pretty sure that Islam doesn't support this. So he went and he actually did the research, and he found that Al Qaeda's defense for their modus operandi was actually bogus. So that's why he left. And he's a fascinating guy. But in the end, anyway, he started working for MI5 and MI6, and had to then go back into Al Qaeda when he wanted to leave them, but then have to pretend that he was a fully fledged member, and sort of go behind the back of his commanders, which was obviously a very dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, that's an incredible story, and you know, it made me think of agents we had here in Ireland that you know that had been IRA members and things like this, and then started working for intelligence services. Sean O'Callaghan is the famous example, and I'm going to write something about Sean soon. But I was thinking more in terms of the actual. So I don't know what the word is. The intelligence officers from MI5 or MI6 and things like that would be operating. They would keep you know, abreast of media circles in the Middle East and things like that, wouldn't they? And you know, have you met people like that?
I mean, often they're not going to tell you exactly.
Yeah, but you know, so they would come across as diplomats or.
Well, yeah. Also, you know, you can sometimes get a briefing as well if you're requested to do so. Not from the Irish embassy, because we don't have as many embassies in, but maybe some embassies that are British, for example, in other capital cities in the Middle East, and that could be off the record and very helpful at times. But you're not. I mean, not going to then know if they're MI5 or MI6 necessarily. Everyone has their own cloak, but it's how helpful and how useful the information is that's important.
I don't know if this is true, but I've heard the Americans are a bit more brash about it. And what do they call it? The CIA, they call it the company or something like that. Is
it the firm or something? I can't remember.
That's a John Grisham novel.
Yeah, I know, but
the company was the one I heard.
Perhaps,
maybe I have it wrong.
Perhaps, yeah. Don't know, but yeah, there is a term for it. I just can't think of it now off the top of my head. But then again, I mean, that's among CIA members who I mean, a friend of mine has a friend who she's convinced, they're American, obviously, and they talk to me about this couple who they're convinced are actually members of the CIA. But I just mainly because they're always in Iraq or something like that, and they are former.
Well, you're always in Iraq or somewhere like that,
exactly.
so
no, but and they used to be in the military, and now they go there because one of them purports to be editor of a philanthropic magazine. But then I'm thinking, that's so lame a cover.
They're definitely
anyway, yeah, but then it's funny because a friend of mine, she also lives not too far from CIA headquarters, and also one of the training grounds. I won't tell you where, but anyway, this beautiful suburb near Virginia, and then her neighbour is then when we go, and I say her husband is quite senior in the military, and she works in that sort of general area anyway, and she's like, oh, there's Mr. and Mrs. Rogers or whatever, totally CIA, and they're like mowing the lawn, pretending to be a retired teacher or something, like, or a retired academic, and as she spent her time like pointing out neighbours of hers that may or may not have been members of the CIA. It's interesting. But anyway, but it is true that behind her house is where Salman Rushdie was hidden by the CIA when he, after the fatwa was issued against him for the satanic verses.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, one of the things I've written an article about, it was about immigration, but primarily about Islam because of the hysteria about Islamic immigration. And there's a lot of disdain for the new atheists who aren't new. Like, it's the same stuff Bertrand Russell was saying. I think most of it is misplaced apart from the accusations of Islamophobia, and I think the accusations of Islamophobia are fairly on point because their argument would be that Islam is a uniquely intolerant religion. Now, what they would say to push that line is that the Quran is considered the unadulterated word of God, and it's only viable in Arabic. So there's no room for exegesis, whereas the Bible is always translation and always to be interpreted. I don't think
that's the reason why they'd say that it's so formidable.
Well, it's one of the reasons they would cite for it being.
Well, mainly because it was translated.
Fundamentalist. They would say it's an inherently fundamentalist religion in that sense.
Well, mainly because also it was Muhammad translated it over 20 years when he wrote the Quran, and he got the words directly from God. So therefore, it is the word of God, and Muhammad is the prophet who was who was chosen to recite the word of God. And to interpret the Quran, they used the Hadith and the Sunnah, which is the actions of the Prophet Muhammad and the words of the Prophet Muhammad. And it's something that has been translated and interpreted over centuries. And actually, there's an argument within Islam as to whether the Quran or Islam has been fully translated or interpreted, because some people would say there's more room for more interpretation as we modernize and keeping in line with the fact that many Muslims don't live in the Middle East anymore, so therefore it's very difficult then to be so fundamentalist about their religion. For example, getting a mortgage or finance and insurance is actually very difficult.
Usury is prohibited.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you're living in the West, that can be very difficult. And there are such things as Islamic mortgages delivered by some banks. And then, generally speaking, that does Islam and the Word of God transcend modernization, or should it be in keeping? And we all have those conversations within Christianity and religion. So it is down to interpretation, and it's a conversation that happens within Islam, and mainly it happens as well because you don't have this central figure who determines what exactly is okay in Islam, whether it's the hijab, the niqab, pork. I guess those things are fundamental. Some Muslims drink wine the odd time, So
that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
I think so. You don't have so their argument would be that the Quran is considered the unadulterated word of God, and so that makes it no room for exegesis and no room for interpretation. But you don't have
interpretation, but it's only certain people's Islamic scholars get.
But you don't have a hierarchy that can do top-down proclamations, or you don't have papal infallibility, for example. That would be inimical to Islam. But my argument against that, kind of portrayal of Islam as uniquely intolerant would be to go to the Middle East and you have Mandaeanism, Zoroastrianism, Yazidism, Samaritanism. So the Samaritans, we think of Samaritans as a helpline you call it, but it's a religion. It's that story from the Bible, and they still exist in the Middle East. In Europe and in the West, where are pre-Christian religions? Well, we didn't allow them to live. We killed them all, or made them
paganism. We still have pagans in this country.
There's no unbroken tradition of paganism. They were forcibly converted and things like that. So.
But anyway, by the way, sorry. I mean, the Yazidis have suffered so.
They are, of course, but they're still there. They still exist. So there's a new form of Wahhabism that is completely intolerant. But I would say that
Afghanistan and some of those countries, like a lot of those different forms of Islam, those people do come under.
Absolutely, and they're blowing up the statues and things like this. But what I'm saying is, though, those pre-Islamic and pre-Christian forms of religion have persisted in the Middle East, and they've been obliterated in the West. So it's ahistorical to say that it's fundamentally more intolerant, because historically it's been more tolerant than Christianity has been.
Well, if that's your sort of barometer, then I suppose that's some sort of an argument. But unfortunately, a lot of those religions have been seriously persecuted.
Of course,
I don't know.
that doesn't take away from it at all.
But then that's not the religion fundamentally either, because a lot of Muslims would rail against.
It's Western intervention that's causing the Wahhabism.
Well, ISIS necessarily was a group that attacked mostly the Yazidis, as well as their own brethren, Shia, Sunni against Shia. So I just don't know if that argument is necessary, because ultimately speaking, the majority of Muslims just want to get on with their life and be
absolutely
peaceful.
So
their interpretation of their religion would be to not engage in sectarianism or act out on their fellow humans. But then there are aspects of Islam that certain aspects of Christianity they clash, and part of it is, for example, that redemption is a very difficult thing in Islam, whereas in Catholicism or Christianity, generally speaking, we go to confession.
You can do what you want and
there is he has now sinned, cast the first stone, and forgiveness within this life is possible through confession and through other elements of maybe undoing what you've done wrong, and whereas that's less so in Islam, and that's very difficult for people who have been accused of sinning against Islam. Ultimately,
there's sanction. There's going to be sanction.
Serious sanction. Sometimes when you hear, for example, people who kill themselves for radical Islamist groups, oftentimes they do it for redemption. They feel like they've sinned so much. This is radicalized kids now, for example, Salah Abdeslam, the Paris attackers, people like that. They're told in prison, you've been drinking, you've been taking drugs, you've done all the things against Islam, you've been a bad Muslim. The only way you can get to paradise now, unless you go to hell, is through redemption, and that is the ultimate sacrifice. That is killing the enemy of Islam, and you'll find that that's quite consistent in part of the reason, part of the motivation behind it.
Yeah, I suppose. The podcast isn't about Islam, but I suppose there's one more thing I want to ask you, because you're so knowledgeable about it. What I found very interesting learning a bit about Islam is the conception of God. So we would I thought when I was a little kid that God was a man in the sky looking down on you, things like this, and we would think that Islam is that, because we conflate it or associate it a lot of the time with misogyny and with patriarchy, which is there, you know, but their conception of God is very different than that. Would you agree? It's
all the same God. It's just that who's the prophet and which religion
but
is
the reason they're not allowed to picture God in Islam, for example, is because he's fundamentally we're fundamentally incapable of understanding God. It's not a person. It's not a person. It's like this presence in the world or whatever.
Well, I suppose how would you even create a picture of it, first of all? So
well, we have done in the West. We a man with a beard.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we came up with that for Hallmark. I don't know if you'd see that anymore though.
You see it.
Have a picture of Jesus, maybe.
Yeah, no, you see it sometimes. It's in Catholic.
You see sometimes the finger coming down, don't you?
Yeah.
Because then we have
like
this
a law.
Yeah. So we have this idea that God is human as well.
Yeah.
But how can he be human? Because then he or she is supposed to be infallible, and we as humans are definitely not infallible.
Your experiences of Islam have, you know, there is a disconnection between the popular perception of Islam and the reality of Islam on the ground.
Yeah, because what's the popular perception of Islam? I mean, it depends on who you talk to, because certain people then just want to see it as something that erodes the culture that we have in Europe,
okay.
which tends to be culturally Christian, whether you're an atheist or not. Culturally
yes.
speaking, that is it, and people see that as something to be feared, because people see Islam as the antithesis to progressive liberal values, and that isn't necessarily so. But certainly, aspects of Islam can be quite conservative. But there's so much more to learn about, and just because people maybe want to be conservative doesn't mean that they aren't suitable for European way of life. So it's more down to actually culture. That element, because you see a lot of women who are the strongest, most amazing women who sometimes wear a niqab because culturally speaking within their community that's what women do,
yeah.
Or women who are Muslims and devout who are like business women, independent women, but see the Quran as something that actually allows them to be feminists. Because remember, the Quran is actually a book that feminists who are Muslim, now this is not a cultural thing, this is the Quran and their interpretation, would say that actually introduced a lot of rights for women. Because, for example, the Quran says that a woman's testimony is worth half a man's. Okay,
yeah.
To us that's outrageous, but in actual fact back then it was worth nothing.
Yeah.
So it incrementally introduced rights for women, and so if you interpret that in today's world, Muhammad and God was saying women deserve a level of equality, and culturally speaking back then you couldn't get full equality, so halfway. But then maybe when people want to interpret that in a regressive sense, can say no, God said half, we'll leave it at half, and that's down to interpretation.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, because my nanny wore a headscarf every time she left the bleeding gaff.
Yes, that didn't make great ads.
Yeah, so a lot of it is cultural rather than religious based.
But in church, a lot of women still wear their.
But I suppose. Yeah, it's interesting though the kind of double standards that we employ in terms of we bomb countries back to the Middle Ages and then complain when they start acting medieval. But we talked about the past. Let's talk about the future. What is the future for journalism? Because I think this is a moment of immense change.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, well, it has been changing for some time with online, and the problem is the decline of newspapers and people wanting news for free. And how are they going to get the news for free? Well, journalists, but they're not going to pay for it. It's not sustainable or reasonable to expect for journalists to do their work for free, for news organisations to get you your news for free, to send a journalist to a different country, pay for their flights and everything, for you to get
I'm agreeing with you here, but everybody's working for free here today.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Exactly,
well,
right?
there might be money down the line, but yeah.
No, but that's the point. But let's say the mainstream perspective, and you want to get it from the Irish Independent website or Reuters or wherever, the idea that you think you deserve it for free, or it's something that people have
it's ingrained.
Now, but it's not sustainable.
Jacobin magazine, for example, got a load of shit, their left-wing publication and things like this, and got a load of shit for putting their articles behind the paywall. Loads of shit, and they said you're supposed to be communists.
Yeah.
Do you not think workers should be paid for doing work? And it is work.
Exactly. Yeah, it's hilarious, isn't it? The double standard.
So
because they want something for free.
Are you nervous about your position? Are you nervous about it being viable, a career in journalism?
Yeah, I mean, we all.
Well, you're very established.
Well, we all think about those things, and whether or not we always think about your career anyway. I mean, for me, focused on the Brexit stuff, which is obviously very
Don't mention the B word. Don't mention the B word.
Relevant.
Eddie Dempsey is going to turn up in spirit here now.
Anyway, the thing is, the Irish Independent does do very well in terms of its readership, its circulation is still very strong. Similarly with the website, but journalism in general, I'm frequently having conversations with my colleagues about the future of it and whether the job is secure or not. And it's a very difficult road ahead for sure.
And INM seems to be secure, but another major outlet I heard might be not viable anymore.
What's that?
Well, I don't know. You tell me.
I don't know, Shona.
No. Well, we'll move swiftly on. Yeah, so the closing question would be, we'd like to give something to our audience here. So if anybody had a budding career in journalism, and a lot of people have contacted me, for example, fucking much better writers than me. There's one guy, or there's a couple of guys in particular, and girls, that I just wish would write and wish had an outlet. There was Josh Jackson, wrote a fucking Facebook comment, and I said this should be a Guardian article about. It was a reaction to an article that was in the Guardian. I told him to pitch it, and nothing seems to have come of it. So it's a difficult field to break into, and I broke into it accidentally. So what advice would you give to people who want to be a journalist?
Where are the gaps? And the gaps, we've discussed them already so many times, is on the ground, talking to people in part of the Irish demographics that haven't been represented by journalists so far, which is people from different socio-economic backgrounds, probably lower socio-economic backgrounds, because that's where the fault line is in this country anyway. When you look at the homelessness crisis, the property crisis, the health crisis, that's the fault line, and so that will always give you fertile ground for writing great stories, and it's actually hugely in demand for the greater good and the greater public interest. So those are the type of areas I would seek to report from, but it also involves making strong connections, improving yourself, and rightfully so. It's a really amazing job, and it's hard to get into, and it should be hard to get into.
It should be, but the contradiction, I suppose, the paradox of Catch-22 is that you need experience to get published.
Catch-22 being about journalism.
Yeah.
Go on, yeah. Sorry, you do need experience. So yeah, I mean.
So how do you get that experience?
And we rail against, and rightfully so, the abuse of some organisations when it comes to internships. But I actually find that because journalism is one of those careers that you learn pretty much everything on the ground and on the job, and that's how you develop and that's how you evolve. If you're doing an internship in a newspaper or a broadcast organisation, and they're giving you actual journalistic work, not photocopying, not tea making, I mean a bit of tea making here and there, right, because you're not going to be doing everything at the start, but if they're giving you proper training, that actually is a decent quality training, and that does serve as an internship. So that is, I don't think, is actually abuse, unless it goes on for 2 years or whatever. So I think you need to get those internships, because you need to be able to prove yourself, and those organisations are not going to allow you to write something unless they know that you're going to write the right thing, be able to prove and have records of all of your contacts, your sources, and make sure everything's accurate. So you have to prove yourself first. Otherwise, like I said, anyone could do it, and not anyone should be able to do it, because it's an important job.
I'd agree with all that. I think we'll close on a toast, and I would toast to independent news and media, but I would put the emphasis on the independent. Cheers. That's a wrap.
Right.
Brilliant.